worth taking seriously. So the reality here, to me, is that Agile teams recognize the value of face-to-face conversation and prioritize their time accordingly. In other words, they don't say we can only communicate face-to-face. If we're not communicating face-to-face, we're not an Agile team. But they recognize that there is something unique and valuable about face-to-face conversation, and they prioritize their time accordingly and use that time well. We're going to talk about that a lot today. Misconception 2, you need to be in the same physical space to be able to build real trust with your team. I believed this for a long time. I was thoroughly convinced for a long time that it would be impossible for me to do the kind of work I do remotely. That has been disproven. In America, where I lived and worked for the majority of my life until a couple months ago, we had this phrase called water cooler conversation. I'm always curious what the international equivalent of this phrase is. But water cooler conversation is what we call the informal conversations that we have, not in meetings and not in calls, but just when we're all kind of hanging out together around the water cooler. Times people say, how was your weekend? What's going on? Like, oh, what's happening here? Like, oh, did you hear about so-and-so? Did you hear about this? These informal conversations are often how people get to know each other. And I have missed them in a remote world. I like being around people and talking to people. But just because we can't build trust this way doesn't mean we can't build trust differently. My friend Sarah Milstein wrote this article, which I think is really interesting. Remote work insights you've never heard before. This is linked in the recommended reading that you can download from the resource widget. And she makes a point here which has really stuck in my brain ever since I read this article. Distributed teams often have higher trust and thus work better than co-located teams. And she supports this with this notion of swift trust. The idea being that when you're working on a remote team, you have to make the choice to trust each other. You can't look over your shoulder and say, is that person showing up as early as I am? Are they busy as much as I am? What are they doing? Who are they talking to? Trusting each other is a choice, but it's a choice you have to make quickly. So I think there's a really interesting notion here that trust is built differently and sometimes more quickly among distributed teams. It's not that distributed teams don't trust each other and can't work together as a team. But it's going to be different. The way we come to trust each other and the way we articulate that trust is going to be qualitatively different from how it was before. This has been a really hard one for me to accept. But once I've accepted it, it's made things a lot easier for me to say, all right, it's not going to feel like we're all in a room together, but that might be okay. There might be new, different ways for us to build trust and for us to collaborate together. Last but not least, distributed work is all about finding the right cutting-edge tools to replicate co-located work. So I've been seeing this happen a lot, where I think the gold rush around this has died down a little bit, but there were all these new tools that were like, this will be just like being in a room together and figuring things out, except it's online. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But if you look at the best productivity tools, a lot of it is stuff that we've already been using. I want to note here, the first statement of the Agile Manifesto is individuals and interactions over processes and tools, which means that readjusting to distributed work is not about finding new cutting-edge tools. Those tools might help us insofar as they help facilitate interactions between individuals. But as we're going to discuss today, the key to doing this well isn't about finding a tool and implementing it. It's about retrospecting with your team, talking with your team, keeping those lines of communication open so that you can work together to figure out how best the specific individuals on your team can collaborate and communicate moving forward. So if there's a big theme that's going to run through today, it's that there are no quick fixes and easy tricks to doing that. The exercises we're going to go through together are reflective exercises that I'd encourage you to do with your team to help your team understand how you're collaborating together in a distributed environment and where the opportunities are for you to work together better. Okay. So our reality here is that distributed work for Agile teams, as with all work for Agile teams, is about individuals and interactions. It's about people. It's communication challenges. It's the stuff that we've actually learned if we've been doing our retrospectives, if we've been continuously improving, if we've been adapting and evolving. We are well equipped to work in this distributed work environment. We just have to stay disciplined about that. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to get into our first little exercise together. So on one hand, we can think about our Agile ceremonies, our activities, the things we do as being mapped out on an axis from co-located to distributed, right? Our work might be fully co-located where we're all in the same physical space, or it might be fully distributed where we're all in different places. There are also lots of hybrid setups which might fall somewhere in the middle here. But if we go back to these 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto, it doesn't say co-located work is the best work. It says the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. And we can focus on that face-to-face piece, but to me, the more important piece of this is this idea of conversation. Face-to-face conversation is synchronous, which is to say messages are sent and received during the same dedicated time, right? We're all sharing a temporal space, a time space, even if we're in different physical spaces. This course is synchronous, and I like doing these courses synchronously a lot more because we can talk to each other. And if I say something that doesn't make sense, you can say, hey, Matt, that doesn't make sense. Can you clarify this? I can answer your questions in real time. Even though this is not face-to-face conversation, it's kind of face-to-text conversation, I always find it much richer to do these things live versus just putting a video out there and hoping that people can do it. Many forms of communication, such as email, are asynchronous, which is to say that messages are sent and received at independent times. So I can send you an email when I have time to send you an email, and you can respond to that email when you have time to respond to that email. Even talking through this at a very high level, you can kind of start to see what the benefits and costs of each of these might be, right? Obviously, when we're doing these things synchronously, it is a chunk of time that has been committed that we have to plan around. We have a little bit more flexibility on the asynchronous side. However, we have a lot more richness, more texture, more opportunity to be generative and collaborative when we're collaborating synchronously. So one of the first exercises I do with teams when I'm helping them understand how they communicate with each other is to map out their Agile ceremonies on this 2x2 grid, from co-located to distributed and from synchronous to asynchronous. So I'm going to walk you through an example of what a ceremony in each of these quadrants might look like. And then I'm going to ask you to start thinking about your team's own ceremonies and where they fall here. Okay. So the classic co-located synchronous example would be our team has a daily stand-up at our desks every morning at 10 a.m., right? You all share a physical workspace. We do our daily scrum or our daily stand-up. We do it together in the same place. That is co-located. We are in the same physical space. And it is synchronous. We are doing it at the same time. Pretty straightforward. A lot of teams are also doing distributed synchronous ceremonies. So for example, our team does a bi-weekly sprint review over Zoom at 3 p.m. on Friday. So in this example, we are distributed. We are using Zoom because we are not in the same physical space, but we are still communicating synchronously. We're doing this over Zoom. We're all sharing the same time, even if we're not necessarily sharing the same place. We can also have a distributed asynchronous ceremony. For example, our team shares blockers in a dedicated Slack channel whenever we discover one. So I've seen a lot of teams make this transition, which we can talk about as well, where rather than bringing blockers to the daily stand-up, they agree, look, if you're blocked, just put that in a Slack channel, and whenever somebody has time to check and to fix it, they'll see it and they'll fix it. So this is one way that some teams have started utilizing asynchronous communication when their goal is to optimize for flexibility. And last but not least, we have our rarest quadrant, the co-located asynchronous quadrant. So for some of you working in Kanban or working in setups where you have a physical backlog or a physical manifestation of your team's work, you might have a centralized board where each of you updates the status of your work as you complete it. So in other words, you might say, okay, we're going to update this on our own time, but in the same place. This is sort of how a lot of the traditional Scrum team's activities may have mathed out, especially pre-2020. But I want to hear from you, because one of the great things about doing these online trainings is you can start to see how different people and different teams are approaching things differently. As I mentioned, there's no one right way to do any of these things, right? Once we embrace that idea of individuals and interactions over processes and tools, we recognize that there's always a different way for each team, depending on the people on that team, what works for them. So what I'm going to ask you to do, let me make sure I have this link here. Yep. I'm going to ask you to map out your team's different ceremonies using the worksheet provided. So I provided you with a worksheet, which we're going to use together here, but really I want you to bring this worksheet back to your team. As I mentioned, these are going to be facilitative team-level exercises we go through, reflective exercises, and they will be most valuable if you do them with your team. You can download this worksheet in the resource widget, which I've highlighted for you. For those of you who have access to and prefer to use Google Docs, I've shared a link with you. Note that this is a read-only template. So you're going to go to File, Make a Copy if you want to use your own version of it. But what I'd like you to do is take a moment and share right here in the group chat where your team's ceremonies fall. So I'm going to do this for my team. So just to model for you what I'm looking for, right? Yeah, so MJ, you you were saying one of the things I most commonly hear, which is that senior leadership needs in-depth training on Agile. That is true in a lot of cases. If you read my book, Agile for Everybody, I get into this a little bit. I think in a lot of cases, senior leadership wants Agile because they think it means one thing. That thing is usually more work being done faster, which is not, to me, what Agile represents. There's nothing in the Agile manifesto that says do more work faster. So I think getting leadership teams on the same page as the working teams, not just about what Agile means, but what specifically it means to them and what they can expect, is a huge challenge. I'm really curious to hear from each of you. One thing you might also realize as you do this, and many teams I've worked with have come to this realization, is that there are certain things they don't really know if they're using synchronously or asynchronously, especially with tools like Slack. I've definitely had people say, oh, I don't know on my team if Slack is synchronous or asynchronous, which is a really important conversation for you to have with your team, right? All in Teams. Does Teams, I haven't used Teams a ton. Does that have synchronous? I believe that Teams has synchronous and asynchronous capabilities, right? So GM, your daily stand-up is distributed synchronous. Oh, interesting. Yeah, KK, we're going to get to that. That's exactly where we're going. We're taking this moment to reflect on where we are, and then we're going to talk about where we can go from there. One of the reasons I like to run this exercise together is you can see how there's usually a pretty wide spectrum of folks who are doing the same thing synchronously or asynchronously. Yeah, VS, that is super real, and that's something for you to retrospect on with your team, right? Because if there are network issues and it's really hard for people to get together synchronously, that might be a reason for you to do more things asynchronously. That's interesting, AL. Every 2 days, a distributed asynchronous update. It's so interesting to see, as I've been doing this for the last 3 years or whatever, I'm seeing more people have less frequent meetings, which is really interesting to me. The 2 times a week or 1 day a week thing, I see happening more and more and more, which is pretty interesting to me, right? Very interesting. Sorry, I'm just reading. I'm reading your answers. Okay. So I want you to take a moment. Yep. So CS, that's the time zone thing is so real. It's really, really hard to work across time zones. And we can talk about how and when deploying some asynchronous things might be really useful as well. So I hope that what you're starting to see, I hope that there are 2 things we can get out of this initial exercise, right? One is for you to start to just think about how your team works together and whether your approach to synchronous and asynchronous communication feels balanced to you. If you're doing everything synchronously, does that feel heavy or is that disruptive? If you're doing everything asynchronously, do you feel like you're missing out on some more textured, nuanced, collaborative, generative conversation? So think about how that balance feels to you. I hope you'll also look at how other folks are doing this. We're about to take a break. I encourage you to spend some time during that break reading back through the group chat and seeing if anyone else's approach seems particularly interesting to you. If there's anything where you're like, gosh, I wish we could do things that way. I wish we just had a video call 3 times a week rather than this daily thing. Or I wish we had a daily thing rather than these twice weekly asynchronous updates. Look at the way that other folks are doing things and think about what resonates with you, what seems interesting to you. All right, I'm putting 5 minutes on the timer. Take a break. Stretch your legs. Read through what your cohorts are doing here, and we'll come back and talk about how we can start to use synchronous and asynchronous communication a little bit more deliberately. All right, we're coming back in about 30 seconds. All right, we're coming back. Welcome back. There's some really interesting conversation happening in the group chat right now that I want to take a moment to talk about before we get into our next bit. MJ here says, I believe some blockers should be discussed during these meetings. That's great. Again, every team is going to work differently. So if your sense for your team is that it's important to talk through blockers in synchronous meetings, that's great. If you look at that and you say, maybe twice a week is like not, maybe we need to identify blockers more quickly and then table some conversations until our synchronous conversations, that'll work too. Every team is different. So again, there's no right and wrong answer here. It's just a matter of what works for you. I also think HD, you make a really good point here that I love when you talk about ad hoc, distributed, synchronous, interactive, as PowerPoint and video only provides a limited subset. You've raised such a good point here, which is that there, in my opinion, and this is what we're about to talk about, there are very few things that are a bigger waste of time than a synchronous meeting where somebody reads a PowerPoint presentation to you. It's always frustrating for me when it's like, all right, I've blocked out 2 hours and all that's going to happen is someone is going to literally read the text on a PowerPoint slide, which I could have read myself on my own time. Which brings us to the change we're about to make, the flip. Even when we were fully co-located, we might not have been using our synchronous and asynchronous time as well as we could. In fact, I will go out on a limb here and say that we definitely were not using our synchronous and asynchronous time as well as we could. And now we not only have a chance to reevaluate and realign, we have to reevaluate and realign, especially as we're figuring out what hybrid looks like and what future of work looks like. Nobody knows. We're all figuring this out together. I think we really have to be more deliberate about how we're doing these things because people are tired. People have been through a lot. I think the whole go to an office and look busy thing is not terribly interesting to anybody right now. And I certainly spent a lot of time in a lot of offices looking a lot busy. So my personal favorite principle in the 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto is this one. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. That's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what I'm encouraging you to do with your team. To look at how you're working together and reflect on how to get more effective. So let's start by talking about the daily stand-up. The daily stand-up or daily scrum meeting is the most commonly practiced Agile ceremony. It was the first Agile ceremony I was introduced to. I was told, all right, if your team wants to be Agile, you have to do this daily stand-up. For those of you doing a daily stand-up, how are they going on a scale of 1 to 10? So if 1 equals basically worthless, 10 equals achieving all its goals. How would you rank your daily stand-ups on a scale of 1 to 10? We have a 4, an 8, a 5, a 4, a 6, a 5, a 6, a 4, a 3. Yeah, if it's an 8 for you, HD, I would say I don't really care what it is according to the made-up rules of Scrum. These are all made-up things. It is very funny to me when people are like, you have to follow. I'm like, these are all made-up things. If it's working for you, it's working. It's all good. So we have a lot in the 4 to 6 range. So again, I think you came to the right place. Because again, this is a problem for you to solve with your teams, right? These are real problems. This is usually about the range I see. I don't know if any of you have ever encountered this mug before. I actually did a talk, a remote talk last year where somebody was drinking out of this very mug while they were on video, which I got a kick out of. I survived another meeting that should have been an email. But I feel like when we're dealing with how best to navigate synchronous and asynchronous communication, there is wisdom in this mug, as well as humor in this mug. I survived another meeting that should have been an email. Now, here's where I think a lot of teams struggle. The default way for a lot of teams to do the daily stand-up is like this, right? They go and do the work asynchronously, and then they synchronously share status. So they get together, and they say, here's what I did, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm blocked on. And it just kind of starts to feel like a grade school book report where everybody's just like, I read a book called Treasure Island, there was a pirate, and the pirate had a parrot, and everyone's just kind of waiting to go their turn. Nobody's really listening. For distributed teams, synchronous status meetings can be really awful because you can see when everyone's doing other stuff, right? It's pretty brutal. This has happened to me several times where I'm talking to people in a meeting and I can just see like everyone's checking their email or doing something else, or they all turn their video off and they're all like, whatever, I don't really care. And I just feel, I'm just like, oh, this is terrible. This is really, really, really bad. Has anyone else experienced this? Has anyone else been in a distributed status meeting where they're just like, oh, I can tell nobody's paying attention. This just feels really, really bad. It feels like the trust and cohesion of the team is just flying out the window as everybody pretends to be half paying attention, but I know they're not paying attention. I've been through this a lot. And then I started thinking more about when I was in colocated meetings. I was like, oh, this was true when we were in an office too. I've spent so much of my life pretending to listen to people in meetings. It's just easier to do it in person, right? You sit there, you know, when I used to do a lot of on-site work for companies, I'd sit there with like my stale bagel and my cold coffee and just be like, oh yes, nod, very serious. Like, but I'm thinking about like, what am I going to have for dinner? What was that book I was going to read? What's going on? But I can just sit there and nod and be like, yes, very serious, much business. And that's fine. We can't really get away with this anymore. But the good news is like, we shouldn't get away with this anymore. We wasted so much of our time insisting that we get together to just read each other things. So again, I think there's a tendency among teams, and I see this on a lot of frustrated teams I coach and advise, a lot of teams that are also in that 4 to 6 range, where they're doing the work asynchronously, they're going off and doing the work, and then getting together and synchronously sharing status. The highest performing teams I work with do the exact opposite. They share status asynchronously, and when they get together, it is to do work. It is to make decisions. It is to finish unfinished things. It is to develop new solutions and explore new problems. So what that looks like in practice is that teams will go off and do their functional work, yes, asynchronously. They'll send pre-reads. They'll do status updates. But when they actually get together synchronously, whether that's co-located or distributed, they're making decisions. They're actually reviewing things. They're co-creating things. They're doing the work together and then sharing the status of the work separately. So I want you to just take a moment and think about how you might reimagine the distributed daily stand-up so that you're doing the work synchronously and sharing status asynchronously. I'd love to hear from a few of you here. What are some steps you might take to reconfigure, especially for those of you who are a 2 or a 3 or a 4 when I asked before how this is going for you? What are some steps you might be able to take so that your team is doing the work synchronously? And again, I'm not saying go off and tell your team, now we're doing things this way. What are some ideas you might be able to bring to your team for how you might put this into action for you to discuss together? I'm glad this is resonating with you, JU. I'd love for you to think, again, everybody, especially those of you who I got those 2s and those 4s from, what are some ideas you could bring back to your team for how you can shift this? Think about it for a second.